Until quite recently, it has commonly been held that every human group has a religion. It has been notoriously difficult to define the word religion and thus to delineate the concept, although myriad attempts have been made. Right? There was a very famous paper published at the beginning of the 20th century, 50 definitions for religion. And that was just at the beginning of the 20th century. By now, we could probably have 500. Notwithstanding this stumbling block, it seems fair to say that in modern usage, we have had a pretty good idea what we mean when we call something a religion, even without being in absolute agreement what it is and what is out, what is in and what is out of the category. At the same time, however, it is increasingly recognized that the concept of religion as an autonomous sphere of human activity, separate or separable from other spheres of activity, named as the realm of the so-called, sogenannte, secular, such as law, politics, kinship, and economics, is itself modern and as Western as is the usage of the word religion to denote that sphere. Because, as is now recognized by many scholars, religion as a concept and category emerged out of the very forces that defined it during the time of the Enlightenment, it becomes very difficult to imagine how a Jewish religion could possibly exist as such before any religion did. That is, before one aspect of the things humans do was separated out, isolated from other cultural activity in general, and named, however it is being defined, religion. Judaism as a religion, as the term is commonly understood today, emerged only as a product of modernity. This point can be sharpened even further, for the forces that historically produced the category of religion as a distinct entity from the secular during the 17th century in Europe are precisely the same forces that raised the Jewish question to the center of attention, that in one way or another it has occupied since then. As Amir Mufti has pointed out, the projects of secularism, citizenship, separation of church and state, national language, national literature and culture have all circled around the question of the Jews. Just to cite one example, the question of how French one had to be included into the polity of the French state was first confronted and debated with reference to the Jews, or as Aimé Césaire once put it, Europe tried out on the Jews what it would later practice in the colonies. There was no separate Jewish faith at all. There were Jewish beliefs, Jewish practices, not all of them liturgical or mandated by the Torah. All of life was Jewish doings. There was no separate religion at all. So that was then. But what about now? Right? This is the move beyond the book that I'm asking about. Aren't the Jews a religion now? Not in any normative or prescriptive sense. There are myriad Jews, myriads of Jews, myriads of myriads of Jews who do not profess any religion and yet are deeply engaged with the Jewish mystery, producing literature and other culture in Jewish idioms, whether in Hebrew or in Yiddish or in both, and in other Jewish languages, including English as well. Sigmund Freud provides an explicit and excellent example, writing as he did that he is free of religion, a godless Jew, but very much a Jew. And they, and Freud as well, are recognized as Jews by other Jews. Manifestly, one does not have to be part of a religion in order to be Jewish. Michael Walzer of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, one of the most distinguished American political theorists, in a strenuous defense of Zionism, demonstrates appositely the fallacy involved in any argument supporting anti-Zionism based on the claim that Judaism is a religion, and that the idea of a Jewish people, a fictional or even fraudulent way of claiming national status for an alleged scattering of religious congregations, that's Shlomo Zahn's language, around the world. Walzer notes that the Jews share many characteristics of a nationality, a national group, or even a nation, even or especially in Ernst Renan's sense. This is one of the few things I disagree with Tomoko about. I rather like Ernst Renan. I save my ire for J.Z. Smith. That the essence of a nation is that all individuals have many things in common, and also that they have forgotten many things. That's remarkable, right? The notion, and let me read it again. This is Renan. The essence of a nation is that all individuals have many things in common, and also that they have forgotten many things. This compelling argument is, in essence, Walzer's reason for denying that the Jews constitute a religion. Here's a second reason for why it's not a good idea to exchange the historical visions of the Jews as a nation for a claim that they are a church, as Durkheim did. If the Jews wish to take advantage of laws that depend on Christian definitions of religion, which are essentially all the definitions there are, we will end up with a Judaism that looks very much like Christianity. That is, belonging defined by belief. Right? Jüdische Glaube, the Jewish faith, something we might call, with no offense intended, Jutheranism. As Gil Anijar has remarked, wittily summing up Edward Said's thinking, wo es war, where Christianity was, there is now religion. Religion is Christian, and if a so-called Judaism is a religion, then it is or has become a variant form of Christianity. If you believe this way, you're a Christian. If you believe that way, you're a Jew, according to this. These beliefs, moreover, are normatively of no interest whatever to the public sphere, normatively. As political theorist and post-colonial writer Amir Mufti, again, has concisely stated, quote, "This is the Jewish emancipation that liberalism promises from its very inception. Enlightenment thus requires the privatization of religious affiliation, that is, its confinement to the patriarchal realm of the bourgeois family under the rubric of practice and belief. The signs of religious affiliation and community must cease to have a public existence," end quote. In other words, the price of so-called Jewish emancipation is the destruction of Jewish community and culture in favor of a confinement of Jewishness to sorts of sentiments and even practices that characterize Protestantism, even though the sentiments and practices are not identical, of course. You go to church on Sunday. We go to synagogue on Saturday. You believe in the Trinity. We don't believe in the Trinity. No wonder Kant observed that Judentum is not a religion. In his day, it was very, very different from Lutheranism. Still, one reason that certain versions of a religion named Judentum has been so successful in post-war Germany is precisely that they look exactly like Protestantism from a broadly cultural point of view, thus eliminating effectively the Judaïté that incorporates way more than Glaube, the modes of eating, dressing, melodies of speech, attitudes to sex, and more that constitute all of Jewish culture. And Max Weinreich pointed out with reference to an earlier scholar's identification of religion, Yiddishkeit, Judaïté, as what joins Jews the world over. This is Max Weinreich. Today, many Jews and Christians live in essentially the same fashion, and the difference all year is merely that the former attend or can attend services on Saturday and the latter on Sunday. In relation to the rise of language, one should not speak of the Jewish religion, but of Jewishness, Yiddishkeit. Right? In the traditional Jewishness of diverse culture areas, there are many variants and even contradictions, and yet Jewishness has linked all Jews over time and space in a community of historical fate and in a consciousness of that fate, end quote. In former times, Jews were a whole, by this I don't mean simplex, culture nation, speaking their own way, worshiping their own way, dressing, eating, marrying, rearing children their own ways. All of this and more were deeply informed by the Talmud, not just worship and all of its appliances, but all of it, and all of it imbricated and intertwined. Impossible to pull one thread and say, this is the religion of the Jews, without the entire fabric unraveling and disintegrating. Franz Rosenzweig at least seems to have understood this clearly, writing to Gerhard Scholem in the context of the usage of such words as Judentum, Jüdische Glaube, to refer to ourselves. Quote, Rosenzweig, 1921. In a sense, we are ourselves guests at our own table. We ourselves, I myself. So long as we speak German, or even if we speak modern Hebrew, the Hebrew of 1921, we cannot avoid this detour that again and again leads us the hard way from what is alien back to our own. End quote. In the past, in the Hebrew of before 1921, and in Yiddish, such usages are not to be found. And by Jüdische Glaube, for instance, and by using them, we take on ourselves a character not ours. The next section of this is called Freedom of Religion and the Offense of Circumcision. The result of defining something called Judaism as a religion, something not ours, is seemingly a grotesque mismatch in which the Christian faith always comes out on top. Legal scholars, Lena Salaima, who is present as it happens, and Shai Levi explicate how the assignment of religion to a separate and defined sphere, and especially its internalization, is what clears out the space of the secular, remarking acutely as well that, quote, late antique Christian criticisms of Judaism linger in the state's construction of religion. What renders such secular clearing and construction of religion Christian, and perhaps especially Protestant, is the focus on the individual and his or her faith, his or her ostensibly free choice to be saved through faith or not. This privatization of religion, taking it out of the public, or at any rate the political sphere, empowers discourses on the model of being a Jew at home and a German in public, to give one example. Right? This was the slogan, of course, be a Jew at home and a German in the streets. And I think in France they said something very similar, but in French. You know, if I try to pronounce French, when I used to try to pronounce French in the presence of my teacher, he would say, and he was German, he wasn't even French. He would, no, not so libre m'écraser. He would say, spell it. So, it hurt his ears less if I just said. What makes the essay of Salaima and Levi particularly relevant here is their specific application to the fraught issue of circumcision. We can see from their discussion how defining Judaism as a religion and its incorporation into a Lutheran concept of religion as faith or belief system, as opposed to corporate belonging, wreaks havoc with Jewish and Islamic self-understandings. For example, a German court, the Court of Cologne, quite recently, by now it's a little less recently, maybe 10 years ago, quite recently wanted to ban infant circumcision as a violation of the infant's self-determination defined as his religious freedom, right? So, when Jews circumcise their infant sons at 8 days old, they are violating their religious freedom, but to prevent a Jew from circumcising their son is an expression of religious freedom, right? According to this Cologne court. By circumcising the child, the father is allegedly prevented from choosing, the son is allegedly prevented from choosing to be or become a Christian or an unbeliever when he grows up. Salaima and Levi show how European state discourses about male circumcision are dependent on the production of religion by the secular state and the construction of circumcision as a matter of private belief. This results in discrimination against so-called religious minorities, paradoxically under the doctrine of religious freedom. That is, according to the Cologne court explicitly, parents, by allegedly choosing a religion for their male infant, by having him circumcised, are equally allegedly depriving this monad individual, right, who has no connections, at 8 days old, is a fully autonomous individual, of his freedom to choose freely to believe in the incarnation and resurrection. Because after all, this poor child has been circumcised, as I would remind you Jesus and Paul both were, by his wicked Jewish parents. The result in the United States is what Will Herberg defined decades ago as the three forms of American Protestantism: Catholic Protestantism, Protestant Protestantism, and Jewish Protestantism. By now we should add Muslim and Buddhist Protestantism as well. My issue here is not, of course, with Protestantism itself, but in the way that, as amply shown by scholars, it ends up defining religion and thus religious freedom on the model of itself, which places individual private faith and salvation over corporate identity and places inner movements of the psyche over communal practices or doings. As Salaima and Levi point out, when this becomes the publicly promulgated version of religion, and especially when it enters into juridical systems, it is inherently discriminatory vis-a-vis Jews and Muslims as opposed to Christians. The Cologne court was imagining the human subject as a monad with no history and completely autonomous in defining their identity, beliefs, practices, and affiliations, while the Jews stand precisely against such notions of the self. Right? I'll say that I think that not all Jews believe anything, so when I say Jews, but I think it's characteristic of Judaism not to accept the idea of the individual as an autonomous monad, but always already embedded in the historical and communal web. We Jews pervade the sources of the non-self of the person who is already, without willing, thrown or inscribed into a bond with others, not of their own free choice. In other words, the Cologne Court, like all colonial powers, that's a joke, Cologne Court, colonial powers, is making judgments on the basis of theological, philosophical bases that it claims are universal, but are in fact highly specific. Thinking of Jewry as being a religion inevitably involves the imposition, even the willing imposition of the West on a people not of the West, however much in it. As in the case of cosmopolitanism, high ideals are shown by this to be colonial impositions of power in disguise. Thus, when Jews claim that Judaism is a religion, we're inevitably falling into a trap, since religion is understood quite differently than Jewish belonging. We ought no longer to reject Immanuel Kant's notorious observation that, quote, Judaism is really not a religion at all, but merely a union of a number of people who, because they belong to a single stock, form themselves into a commonwealth under purely political laws and not into a church, end quote. You know, it's one characteristic of my intellectual career that I have always found that anti-Semites see Jewish difference very clearly, all the way going back to Augustine's carnal Israel, right? Their values, the values that they put on it may be perverse, and usually are. But the perception is, I'd rather have Kant saying this, which I think is absolutely correct, than the wonderful great Dietrich Bonhoeffer generously allowing Jews to be a religion. The rejection of faith is precisely signified, as Kant understood well, in the pre-conscious marking of the penis. The sign is only for men, of course, but the demand is to men and women alike. This is meant as descriptive, not normative, nor apologetic claim on my part. I'm not claiming, nor ever would suggest that there is anything feminist about pre-9/11 Judaism. A testimony. In 1795, in a letter to the writer David Veit, I think it's Faul, the first letter, Berlin Salon Jewess, Rachel Varnhagen, confessed that she imagined that at her birth, quote, some supramundane being plunged these words with a dagger into my heart. Yes, have sensibility, see the world as few see it, be great and noble, nor can I deprive you of restless, incessant thought, but with one reservation, sei eine Juden, be a Jewess. She goes on to say, now my life is one long bleeding, and declares defiantly, I shall never accept that I am a Schlemiel and a Jewess. A dagger in the heart, a scalpel to the penis. The claim of Jewishness is also a theoretical and rhetorical claim, a command to the child, be a Jew. Varnhagen's confession is a perfect example of the experience of interpellation, not interpolation, but interpellation. You know, the cop grabs you by the shoulder and says, come with me, criminal, right? Or it's defined, the process by which ideology embodied in major social and political institutions constitutes the very nature of individual subjects' identities through the process of hailing them in social interactions. Varnhagen was unhappy at this constitution of her subjectivity as a Jew against her will. Franz Rosenzweig, a Jewish philosopher in Frankfurt over a century later, implicitly manifesting the same sense, was happy with it. Its experience, as many of us do, an affect that in my wild youth I called jouissance. Here, of course, one might... Jouissance? I know you don't know French, but it's Here, of course, one might claim that gender is one possible differentiating factor, although by no means an ineluctable one, even in early modern Europe. I repeat that I am not making here a feminist point nor an apology for anything. This being thrown, however, as it were, into the world as a Jew, called at birth, as it were, is experienced differently, obviously, by different individuals and classes of individuals, especially in this circumstance, genders, but it has its power nonetheless, as Varnhagen testifies. Even when we reject later on, and we are free to do so, the tradition into which we are born, that rejection shapes us also. Only the powerful symbolic marker of that existential givenness, the mark of the covenant, remains to remind us that Jewishness for men and for women is not chosen. We are thrown into the world Jews, to make of that what we will. It is this thrownness of interpellation that the Cologne court wishes to cancel. With the entry into the modern enlightened world, there is an entrance fee, a fairly steep one. As W.J.T. Mitchell once remarked wittily, and in another context, there is no representation without taxation. This movement into modernity constitutes a total paradigm shift in German Jewish self-consciousness, a shift that extended itself ultimately far beyond German lands. It is owing to the shock waves released by that earthquake that in the present, by and large, there is a nearly perfect binary and mutually exclusive opposition in conceptions of what the Jews denotes, a religion or a nation stroke ethnicity with seemingly no other options. The danger of even buying into the binary opposition, religion stroke nation, is palpable, whatever choice we make. Another court case in a Western European court makes this clear. The British Supreme Court in 2009 decided a case against an Orthodox Jewish school, which, allowed to discriminate by British law, by religion, right? They can take only Jews, or a Catholic school can take only Catholics. That's legal. But this school rejected a boy who, though allegedly devout, did not have a Jewish mother. The court's reasoning is as illuminating as that of the Cologne court. Quote, "One thing is clear about the matrilinear test. It is a test of ethnic origin." Lord Phillips, president of the court, said in his majority opinion. Under the law, he said, quote, "By definition, discrimination that is based upon that test is discrimination on racial grounds." Unquote. Note several things about this opinion. First of all, it conflates ethnicity with race. Secondly, it ignores the simple fact that the child could simply have undergone a conversion ceremony. One cannot normally convert into a race, suggesting at the very least that the English judge was not thinking very deeply or subtly. I have also never heard of a racial determination based on whether or not a progenitor was male or female. Right? All people are half African if their father is African or if their mother is African. So clearly this definition of who is a Jew on the basis of the mother but not the father is something that's phenomenologically very different from a racial designation. Had that mother converted properly, would her race have changed? It is at least possible, and I will argue that it is the case, that whatever it is that constitutes Jewish genealogy, it is not identical to race. Moreover, the religious bias involved in the court's ruling becomes totally clear in a further statement about the opinion. Quote, "The ruling represents a definitive end to 6 decades of exclusion of children who are devout in their Jewish faith, but considered by some to be not Jewish enough to enjoy the benefits of their community's leading faith school." Right? And this was one of the lawyers in the case. Notwithstanding the fact that some millennium and a half of the definition of Jewishness via the mother, and not 6 decades of some clerical prejudice lie behind the school's policy, this quotation is very telling. What determines, perhaps, who is an Anglican is their devoutness, and the school is a faith school. For Jews, at least for some, faith, by which is meant assent to certain propositions, is required of Jews. But in no opinions rendered by traditional Jewish authorities is it determinative of who is a Jew or not. Jews are always going to be in trouble when we have Protestants determining who is or who is not a Jew. We will see, however, that the racialized understanding of Jewishness is an ever-present danger which must be guarded against vigilantly. I'm in my last few pages, don't panic. Franz Rosenzweig is crucial here, because in what seems at first glance to be a notoriously racist account of Jewish collective existence, he actually provides, on careful rereading, what I take to be a way to interpret Jewish genealogy in precisely a non-racist way. This reread Rosenzweigian account is thus crucial to my project here of rendering strong, vital attachment to Judaïté part of a progressive way of life. By the way, the reason why I say Judaïté is because I don't want to use the term Yiddishkeit, which is Ashkenazocentric. Whereas, French, as we know, is not only a universal language, it's also the language of most of the Jews of the southern hemisphere, which are only called Eastern Jews in Hebrew because the Poles got promoted from Ostjuden, so they had to stick somebody else into that category. That might sound like a joke, but I think it's the case. In a provocative declaration that seems at first, and perhaps even second glance, to blow a staggeringly racist dog whistle, Rosenzweig, contrasting the Jew with the Christian, says, quote, "Only he belongs to Christianity who knows his own life to be on the way which leads from Christ come to Christ coming. This knowledge is belief. It is belief as the content of a testimony. It is belief in something, Glaube an etwas. That is exactly the opposite of the belief of the Jew." This is Rosenzweig. "His belief is not the content of a testimony, but rather the product of a reproduction. The Jew, engendered a Jew, attests his belief by continuing to procreate the Jewish people. His belief is not in something, he is himself the belief." This claim has been interpreted as a bare confession of racial superiority. One recent scholarly reader even interpreted it to mean that the Jew is meant to worship himself. But Rosenzweig's claim here is not only is not a racist account, as we shall see, but provides us with a way out of the terrible pitfall of Jewish supremacy and racism, which do indeed dog our heels. They are ever-present danger in Jewish life, as is only becoming more and more evident in the last days and weeks and months. Right? So I'm not suggesting for a moment that Jews are not in danger of becoming racist, but I'm saying it is not in the essence of historical Jewish identity. Rosenzweig stands in opposition to racism precisely because he attributes no superior character to the Jews. Indeed, attributes to them no character at all, surely nothing innate, other than the sheer existential fact of being genealogically a Jew. The Jew is pure existence as a Jew. This existence is prior to any essence, whatever. Right? If this sounds a little like the husband of Simone de Beauvoir speaking, I've learned a lot. What's at issue is how to signify that difference today. In the antinomies, whose impasses I'm trying to suggest we should and can escape, the alternative to signifying Jewishness as a religion has seemed sometimes to be only to represent it as constituted by race. This is borne out, it would seem, by the recent actions of the Israeli rabbinate, or at any rate some of it, in declaring folks Jews on the basis of their mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA traces descent through the matrilinear line, as opposed to nuclear DNA that is transmitted by both parents. Since, according to normative rabbinic practice from antiquity on, Jewishness is determined by the mother and not the father, the presence of Jewish mitochondria, quote unquote, are being taken somewhat grotesquely, again by some rabbis, to indicate true Jewish descent going back forever. This is to me and to many others a horrifying instance of biologization of a cultural conception. Since the very stated reason for matrilineal descent in rabbinic tradition is that the mother raises the child most intimacy, right? It hardly seems to attend at all to the meaning of that law to claim that someone is Jewish simply because 15 generations ago someone in the family from whom they are descended happened to be Jewish. Even if no one has known of that biological fact until the invention of genetic testing. That indeed would smack of racism in its grossest terms. But is it so? Rosenzweig, I contend, shows us why not. Some rhetorical questions. Has this been the historical self-conception of the Jews, as opposed to the Nazis' conception of the Jews, for instance? Do practices of genealogy and endogamy constitute the Jews as a race, or even more troubling, as necessarily racist? Have the Jews imagined themselves as biologically different from other peoples of the earth? For the vastly greater part, the answer to these questions is no. Racialized Jewish self-fashioning is, I think, something of an anomaly, although to my horror, less and less so. You know, I can't help but commenting, and this is not a political statement. There are the right wing in Israel, and they are not marginal anymore, not marginal enough. I mean, certain that speak in exactly Nazi terms. Some even admit it. They say the Nazis were right, but they got it wrong. It's the Semites who are supreme over the Aryans, or the Jews over the Germans. I mean, this is a disease that I'm afraid, if it's not cured quickly, will kill the patient, God forbid. In the stories Jews tell about themselves and each other, their shared narrative, the narrative of the Jewish collective, the model for thinking about Jewish corporate existence is and has been that of family. Sela Boyarin, this happens to be my granddaughter, had gotten this at the age of 4. She asked me, "Are you Jewish, Zadie?" I said, "Yes, I sure am." "Sela, because you're in the family. I'm Jewish too, because I'm in our family." We are Jews owing to the fact that we are a family. And you don't choose your family, nor are you part of it owing to its particular character, for better or worse. And family is much more than a matter of some molecules in the body. While families can and do incorporate much violence, this is surely a superior way of thinking of the genealogical component of the existence of the Jews to racial or racialized thinking. Insistence on family intimacy and shared interest does not imply anything essentialistic about the particular family, just that it is a family, and certainly not that it is superior in essence to all other families or any other family. The finest, most precise, and also beautiful articulation of this kind of connection has, I think, been given by legal historian Patricia Williams. She's teaching at Columbia University and extraordinary. It is worth an extended quotation. I quote, "I cannot help but see the bodies of," she's African American. She writes, "I cannot help but see the bodies of my near ancestors in the current caravans of desperate souls fleeing from place to place, chased by famine, war, and toxins. The bodies of my ancestors may sound romantic, but I take the idea seriously. I am not speaking here of biologized inheritance, my epigenetics, my predispositions for depression or resilience. Instead, I mean the inheritance of linguistically and rhetorically embedded traditions passed on in habits of speech. I am composed of the voices of those who bred me. We are talked into the world by our forebears, by how they parsed words or not. Their emotional inflections and instincts for fight or flight inhabit us, inhabit me. Their accented soundscape is the familiarity through which we filter all experience. It is an idea of home, even when groundless or unsupported by structure or bereft of actual landscape." End quote. When I read this, I realized that these are exactly words that I want to say about Jews, without claiming any particular political or moral equivalence between the Black and the Jewish historical experiences. These words vocalize for me precisely that sense of intimacy that is not biologically conditioned. If I could have, I would have written these words myself. They so clearly capture what I want to say. We too have a collective grounded in a soundscape, a familiarity through which we filter experience. I left out the all. Insofar as these specific, rhetorically embedded traditions are shared by others who equally are divested of actual landscape and do it somewhere else, we have a diaspora, a family, ancestors, grounded in a narrative of genealogy and not of sovereignty, time and not space. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. Thank you.
Schalfu tzarim charbam libam, chafu dvarim lochen bekirbam, shadedu arim evion bribam, kire samtif kana, konenu yetarim lachtot mrivam, vestachu chaverim afar borbam, umipaz yekarim dakrub charbam, chatetzam lelibam tfalachna, umamot ים הומים, ופרצו עליי משתחררים, ובזו מילי פניי קורבים, ויהין חדרם תרבצנה, סביבני צלילי כמו ערמים, כסו תהילי פני קרבים, מעוללי נלחמים, יליד עליהם חסנה. וים דוברות, חשלו קרוצים במפלגרות, האמת מכסים אך לחרות, עברות לראשם והגר